The rain had been falling on Wexford Hall for 3 days when the family finally gathered to hear what Eleanor Thornbury had left behind. Nadia Merrick arrived last and on foot. She had missed the branch line connection at Shrewsbury and walked the final mile from the village up the long gravel drive, her coat soaked through at the shoulders, a canvas bag of her grandmother's letters held against her chest to keep them dry. She did not own a car worth the petrol to drive this far. She had not told anyone she was coming. She rarely told anyone anything. The others were already in the drawing room when she stepped inside, and she felt the temperature of their attention drop the moment they registered her. Her Aunt Verity, in charcoal cashmere, glanced at Nadia's wet hem and looked away as though she'd seen something unfortunate on the pavement. Her cousin Rupert, who ran a boutique investment fund out of a glass office in Canary Wharf, did not look up from his phone. His sister Cressida offered the sort of smile people give at funerals when they've already spent the inheritance in their heads. "We started without you," Verity said. "We assumed the invitation had been mislaid. You're rather far from London." "I'm not in London anymore," Nadia said quietly, and took the empty chair by the window, the one nobody else had wanted because the radiator beneath it had been dead for 2 decades. The solicitor, a spare gray man named Mr. Pettigrew, who had handled the Thornbury affairs for 30 years, waited for her to settle before he cleared his throat and lifted the will. Nadia already knew how they saw her. The failure. The one who'd trained as a conservator of manuscripts and antiquities, and then, at 34, vanished from anything resembling a career. The one who lived in 2 rooms above a bookbinder's in a market town nobody in this family could have found on a map. The one who had sent Eleanor a letter every single week for 11 years, and who had come, quietly, without announcement, sometimes twice a month across 3 hours of trains, to sit with an old woman everyone else found tiresome once her money became a matter of when rather than whether. They had not visited. That was the thing nobody in the room wanted said aloud. In the last 4 years of Eleanor Thornbury's life, when she could no longer host, no longer sparkle, no longer be useful, Verity had come twice. Rupert once for 90 minutes to discuss what he called estate liquidity. Cressida had sent flowers and a card signed by an assistant. Nadia had come 41 times. She had counted, not out of resentment, but because Eleanor had counted and had told her so, near the end, in the greenhouse among the dying orchids. "You're the only one who ever came to see me," the old woman had said, "and not the house." Mr. Pettigrew began to read. The preliminaries were dull bequests to the housekeeper, to the gardener, to a hospice in Ludlow. Verity's fingers drummed once against her knee. Rupert finally put his phone away. And then the solicitor reached the clause that changed the shape of every face in the room. "The residuary estate," he read, "comprising Wexford Hall and its contents, the London property, and the whole of my financial holdings, I leave to my granddaughter Nadia Merrick, the only grandchild who visited me not for what I had, but for who I was." The silence lasted exactly as long as it took for the words to be understood. Then Verity laughed a short, disbelieving sound. "That's absurd. That's Pettigrew. That cannot be legally sound. My mother was not herself. Everyone knew. She'd become confused. She was assessed by 2 physicians within the relevant period," Mr. Pettigrew said, without heat. "The will is sound." Rupert had gone very still. "How much," he said, "are we talking about?" The solicitor named a figure. It was a large figure. It was, in fact, a figure large enough that Nadia, who had walked a mile in the rain rather than pay for a taxi, felt the room tilt slightly around her. But she watched their faces, and she understood something they did not yet realize she understood. She had spent 41 visits sitting in this house. She had catalogued its libraries because Eleanor asked her to. She had read the estate papers because someone had to, and no one else would. And she knew, the way she knew the difference between a genuine 15th century binding and a clever Victorian fake, that the number Mr. Pettigrew had just read aloud was wrong. Not wrong in the will. Wrong in the world. Because most of that fortune on paper no longer existed. It had been moving quietly for the better part of 3 years, out of the estate and into a lattice of holdings she had first noticed 18 months ago in a ledger Eleanor had pressed into her hands without explanation, saying only, "Keep this. Don't read it until you have to. You'll know when." She looked at Rupert, at the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he'd hoped no one else could do, and she thought, "You already know it's not there. That's why you came." "Well," Nadia said and stood, gathering her bag of letters. "I imagine there's a great deal to go through." "You imagine nothing," Verity said sharply. "You'll contest nothing, sign nothing, touch nothing until we've had proper counsel. You have no idea what this estate involves. You conserve paper, for heaven's sake. You mend old books." Nadia paused at the door. "Yes," she said, "I do. I'm very good at telling when something old has been altered to look like something it isn't." And she went out into the rain to find a room, leaving behind her a family that had, for 11 years, made exactly one mistake about her. The same mistake, over and over, in slightly different clothes. They had assumed that a woman who asked for nothing wanted nothing, and that a woman who watched quietly wasn't seeing anything at all. The rain had stopped by the time Nadia found the fox and feathers, the only in the village still kept, and she took the smallest room under the eaves because it was the cheapest, and because she liked the sound of weather on a close roof. She spread her grandmother's letters across the narrow bed to dry them, one by one, and among them she laid the ledger. She had not looked inside it in 18 months. Eleanor's instruction had been absolute, don't read it until you have to, and Nadia was a person who honored instructions, partly by temperament and partly because her whole profession was the discipline of not doing the thing your hands itched to do. You did not clean a manuscript because it looked dirty. You waited. You tested. You understood the object before you touched it. But Eleanor was in the ground now, and the family had counsel, and Nadia thought, this is what she meant by when. The ledger was bound in worn green buckram, and the first thing she noticed, the thing anyone in her trade would have noticed, was that it had been rebound. The boards were older than the paper inside. Someone had taken an antique cover and fitted it to a modern block, the way you might hide new money in an old wallet. Eleanor had done it deliberately. A book that looked like a family heirloom so that no one would think to open it. Inside, in her grandmother's precise hand, were columns of dates going back 4 years, and beside them sums. Large sums, moving out of accounts Nadia recognized from the estate papers she'd read aloud on winter afternoons. But they did not vanish into nothing. Each figure had a destination, written in a shorthand of initials and reference numbers, and against perhaps a third of them Eleanor had drawn a small pencil mark, a check or a cross or once, chillingly, a single word. No. Nadia sat with it for a long time. She understood accounts the way she understood documents, as objects that told 2 stories, the one on the surface and the one underneath. And the story underneath this one was that her grandmother had spent the last years of her life quietly pulling her fortune apart and moving it somewhere, and that she had been checking, item by item, whether it arrived. The crosses meant it hadn't. The word no meant something worse than that. She turned to the back, where Eleanor had tucked a single folded sheet, and here the old woman's hand was shakier, later, written when the illness had already taken hold. Nadia, the numbers Pettigrew reads will be too small. That is not error. Someone has been helping themselves for years and calling it management. I could not prove it alone, and I did not trust the ones who could. You will see what I could not, you always could. Start with the Ashworth transfers. Trust the housekeeper. Trust no one who asks first about the money. Ashworth. The reference recurred a dozen times in the columns, always paired with a cross. Always money that left and never, by Eleanor's own checking, arrived where it was said to go. And Nadia knew the name. Ashworth Marival was the private wealth firm that managed the Thornbury holdings. had managed them for years, and the man who ran its family office division, whose signature appeared on the estate correspondence she'd read 100 times, was a smooth, well-tailored figure named Julian Ashworth. Rupert's business partner, the co-founder of the fund in Canary Wharf. The man Rupert had brought into the family's financial life 8 years ago with the words, Nadia now remembered, he'll take the boring parts off your hands. She looked at the check marks and the crosses and the single flat no, and she felt the shape of it settle into place, not the whole of it, not yet, but the size of it. This was not a will dispute. A will dispute was what Verity thought she was fighting. This was years of money quietly bleeding out of an old woman's estate through the firm that was trusted to protect it. And Eleanor had known, and had told no one, and had left the proof to the one grandchild everyone else was certain understood nothing but paper. You conserve paper, Verity had said. You mend old books. Nadia closed the ledger. Downstairs, the innkeeper was calling last orders. Outside, a car she didn't recognize moved slowly up the village street and stopped, its engine idling, its headlights off, the particular behavior of someone who does not want to be seen arriving but wants very much to see. She stood back from the window and watched it sit there in the dark for a full minute before it moved on. Someone in that drawing room had noticed how quickly she'd stopped being surprised. And someone had already decided that the quiet grandchild, the one who saw when old things had been altered to look like what they weren't, was the most dangerous person to have inherited anything at all. Mrs. Halloran had kept the house for 31 years, and she found Nadia in the churchyard the next morning, standing at Eleanor's grave in the thin, early light. I hoped it would be you, the housekeeper said without preamble. She was a broad, plain-spoken woman of 60-odd with hands that had scrubbed and mended and carried for 3 decades, and she did not offer condolences, which Nadia was grateful for. She told me near the end. Said if a will was read and the wrong faces went pale, I was to trust whoever kept their head. You kept your head. Verity's been on the telephone since 6 shouting at lawyers. She told me to trust you, Nadia said. Something eased in the older woman's face. Then come up before the others are about. There's a thing she wanted you to have, and I'd not rest easy handing it over in front of that lot. They walked back to the hall through the wet grass, past the greenhouse where the orchids were already dying without Eleanor to tend them, and Mrs. Halloran let them in through the kitchen door with a key she kept on a cord around her neck. The house at that hour was enormous and still, dust sheets over the far furniture like sleeping animals. In the old scullery, behind a panel Nadia would never have found, Mrs. Halloran drew out a document box, plain, fireproof, modern, utterly out of place in a house of antiques. She had me hide it 3 winters ago. Said Ashworth's people came to inventory now and again, and she didn't care for the way they inventoried. Went into rooms they'd no business in. She stopped trusting the walls. Inside the box were statements. Not Eleanor's shorthand this time, but the real thing, original quarterly reports from Ashworth Marival, the glossy kind sent to reassure the wealthy that their money was in careful hands. And clipped to each one, in Eleanor's shaking pencil, a second set of figures, her own. Copied painstakingly from the actual bank accounts, which Nadia now understood the old woman had gone to the trouble of accessing directly, in person, at branches, because she no longer believed what the firm posted her. The 2 sets did not match. The firm's statements showed a portfolio that grew, modestly and respectably, year on year. Eleanor's real figures showed money leaving in a slow, patient bleed, never enough at once to alarm, structured as fees, as rebalancing costs, as investments in funds that Nadia, reading the names, was almost certain did not meaningfully exist. Ashworth-managed vehicles paying money to other Ashworth-managed vehicles, the loss dressed each time in the vocabulary of prudence. It was, Nadia thought, exactly like a forgery, not a crude one. A patient one, the kind where every individual element is plausible and only the whole, seen by an eye trained to see holes, is impossible. How much? She asked quietly. Over how long? She reckoned years, said Mrs. Halloran. She reckoned most of it. She used to say the fortune everyone was circling like crows was mostly gone already, and the crows didn't even know. The number Pettigrew reads will be too small. That was what Eleanor had meant. The will left Nadia a fortune that, on the estate's own books, still appeared to exist, and the moment the estate was properly examined, the family would discover that the inheritance they were fighting over had been hollowed out from the inside long before Eleanor died. And when they discovered it, they would need someone to blame. They would blame her, the unknown grandchild who'd inherited everything and then, how convenient, found the coffers empty. He'll come to see me, Nadia said. It wasn't a question. Ashworth, he'll come to help me understand what I've inherited. He rang the house at 8, Mrs. Halloran said grimly. Very warm, very sorry for the family's loss, very keen to sit down with the new beneficiary and walk her through it all, seeing as it's complex and seeing as she's not, forgive him, a financial person. Nadia almost smiled. She closed the fireproof box and thought about all the years she had spent being not a financial person, not an important person, the grandchild who mended books, and how that assumption had just become the most useful thing she owned. Because a man who thought he was about to explain a portfolio to a sentimental woman who conserved paper would not, at first, be careful. He would perform competence at her. He would leave things unsaid because he was certain she couldn't hear them. And she had, in her canvas bag, 18 months of a dead woman's meticulous parallel bookkeeping, and a professional lifetime of knowing exactly when the thing in front of her had been altered to look like something it wasn't. Let him come, she said, and Mrs. Halloran, when he does, I'll need you to do one thing. The housekeeper waited. Bring the tea yourself. Stay in the room, and don't, whatever he says, let him think you matter. Nadia lifted the box. People say a great deal in front of the person they've decided is furniture. I've been that person my whole life. I know exactly how much you overhear. Mrs. Halloran looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since the churchyard, she smiled. Julian Ashworth's car, sleek, dark, and this time in no hurry to hide, turned up the gravel drive a little after 11. Julian Ashworth had the kind of good looks that money maintains silver at the temples on purpose, a suit that fit the way suits fit when 3 people have measured you. He came into the drawing room with both hands out and grief already arranged on his face, and Nadia understood within 4 seconds that he was very, very good at this, and that he had done it many times, and that no one had ever caught him. Miss Merrick, Nadia, may I? I feel I know you. Eleanor spoke of you constantly. He took her hand in both of his, warm and dry. This is a dreadful time to be handed something so complicated. I want you to know I'm here to make it simple. You shouldn't have to carry any of the weight. That's very kind, Nadia said, and let herself sound a little lost, a little overwhelmed by the room and the rain and the sudden fortune. She sat where the light fell on her and left him the better chair. Mrs. Halloran came in with the tea and set it down and stayed, invisible, arranging cups at the sideboard, and Ashworth's eyes passed over her without landing. He talked for 40 minutes. He was superb. He walked her through the estate the way you'd walk a child through a museum. The London property, the holdings, the vehicles, using the word fund and the word structure, and the word tax-efficient with a fluency designed to reassure and to exhaust. He told her the portfolio was in good order but complex, that Eleanor in her final years had made some emotional decisions he gently steered her away from, that there had been market headwinds, that the figure in the will was a starting point, and the real position would take months to reconcile. So the money, Nadia said, with just the right amount of confusion, is less than the will says. Estates always are, he said gently. People imagine a number and reality is more modest. It's my job to protect you from disappointment and from anyone who might, a delicate pause, take advantage of a moment like this. Your family, I'm sorry to say, are already circling. Trust no one who asks first about the money. He had asked about nothing else. You've managed it a long time, she said. 8 years, longer than she trusted anyone, he smiled. I loved her in my way. And then he made his one mistake. The small one, the human one, the kind Nadia had spent her whole career learning to see. He reached for his tea, comfortable now, certain of the room, and he said warmly, meaning it as reassurance. You mustn't worry about the Marival Continuation Fund. That's the one Eleanor fretted over most, near the end. I promise you it's perfectly sound. I moved it myself, personally, in the March before last, precisely so it would be safe. Nadia did not change her face, but something in her went very cold and very clear, the way it did when she held a document up to raking light and the alteration leapt out of the paper. Because she had the ledger, and in the ledger against the Marival Continuation Fund in the March before last, her grandmother had drawn a cross money out, never arrived, and beside it in her shaking hand the single flat word. No. Eleanor hadn't fretted over that fund. She had caught it. It was the one she'd checked in person, at a bank with her own eyes, and found empty when Ashworth's statement swore it was full. It was the specific transfer that had told an old woman her manager was a thief. And he had just told Nadia, unprompted, that he'd moved it himself, personally, in exactly that month, placing his own hand on the one theft she could prove. He thought he was soothing a grieving amateur. He had just signed the top of the page. Thank you, Nadia said quietly. That's a great relief. I don't understand any of it, really. I only wanted to know it was safe. It's safe, he said, and patted the air between them and finished his tea, and told her not to sign anything the family put in front of her, only what he sent, and left his card, and went back out to his sleek dark car pleased with a morning's easy work. When the gravel had stopped crunching, Mrs. Halloran turned from the sideboard. He never once looked at me, she said. No, said Nadia. She was already opening the canvas bag, taking out the green buckram ledger, turning to the cross and the word no in the March column. He didn't look at either of us. That's the whole method. He decides who in the room can't hurt him, and then he stops watching them. She set Eleanor's ledger beside Ashworth's glossy statement, the lie and the proof of the lie side by side on the tea table. Grandma spent 3 years being furniture in her own house, so he'd say too much in front of her. And he did. She looked up, and for the first time since the churchyard there was something in her face that her family, had they seen it, would not have recognized at all. He just told me exactly where to dig, she said. Now I need to know where the money actually went, because it didn't vanish. Money never vanishes, it only moves and changes its clothes. And I spend my life proving what old things really are underneath what someone's dressed them up to be. Outside, the unmarked car from the night before was parked again at the foot of the drive. This time, Nadia walked to the window and let it see her looking. The trail out of the continuation fund did not want to be followed, which told Nadia she was following the right thing. She spent 2 days at it, working the way she worked on a damaged manuscript. No forcing, no guessing, one verified layer at a time. Mrs. Halloran brought her the estate's paper archive box by box from the room Ashworth's people had liked to inventory, and Nadia laid it all out on the long refectory table in a house so quiet she could hear her own pencil. She did not use the internet more than she had to. She did not trust it not to look back. What she built over those 2 days was a map. The Marival Continuation Fund had, on Ashworth's statements, simply grown. But Eleanor's real figures showed the money leaving in the March before last, and Ashworth had put his own hand on that month in the drawing room. So Nadia followed March. The sum that left the continuation fund did not go to some invented offshore shell, which was what she'd expected. Those were harder to touch and harder to prove. It went in 3 near-identical tranches disguised as advisory fees and co-investment, into a vehicle called Halewood Strategic Partners. And Halewood, When she traced its filings through the dull public record Ashworth had assumed a paper mender wouldn't know how to read, listed among its principals a nominee director, a name that meant nothing, and a registered correspondence address that meant everything. It was the address of the glass office in Canary Wharf, Rupert's fund. Nadia sat back in Eleanor's chair and let it settle. Not Ashworth alone, then. Ashworth had the access, the trusted manager's key to an old woman's fortune, but the money didn't stop with him. It flowed through Halewood into Rupert's operation, where it could be dressed as capital, as returns, as the impressive performance a young man showed his other investors to bring in more of their money. Her cousin's boutique fund, the glass office, the confidence, some meaningful part of it had been built on the slow, patient draining of his own grandmother's estate. That was why Rupert had come to the reading of a will he'd barely visited the woman behind, not for what he'd inherit, for what he was terrified would now be examined. The moment Nadia truly owned the estate, she owned the right to audit it, and the hollow place where the fortune had been would lead, if anyone competent followed it, straight to his door. They hadn't expected anyone competent. That evening, the threat changed its clothes for the first time. It came at first as courtesy. Rupert himself, alone, no Verity, no lawyers, arriving at the Fox and Feathers just after dark and buying her a drink she didn't touch. He was charming in the family way, rueful about the funeral, warm about how unfair it all was that Nadia had been dropped into the middle of a mess she couldn't be expected to understand. "Let me buy it from you," he said eventually, easily, as though it were a kindness. "The whole estate, a clean number paid now, no waiting on Pettigrew and no fighting Verity. You walk away comfortable for life and never think about any of it again." He named a figure. It was generous. It was, Nadia understood, precisely the price of never having the money traced. "That's very fair," she said. "It's more than fair. Nadia," he leaned in, and for a moment there was something almost sincere in him, the boy she half remembered from childhood summers before money got into him. "Take it, please. You don't want this, trust me. Some inheritances are worth more when you don't look at them too closely." "Because of what's underneath," she said. Just that. Two words placed carefully on the table between them, the way you set down an object and let someone realize you know what it is. She watched it land, watched the sincerity go out of his face like a light switched off, and something older and colder come up behind it, not the cousin, but the man who'd spent 8 years learning from Julian Ashworth exactly how to say management when he meant theft. "I don't know what you think you found," Rupert said quietly, "sitting up here with the housekeeper and your grandmother's little notebooks, but you should be careful. You mend books, Nadia. You don't understand the size of what you're standing near. Men like Julian, the people behind Julian, the ones whose money is in these structures, they don't lose gracefully, and they don't much care who ends up carrying the blame when something breaks. A woman alone in a village inn, no career, no husband, suddenly holding a fortune nobody can account for. Think about how that looks. Think about how easy it would be to make it look worse." He stood and left the generous drink, and paused at the door of the little inn. "The offer's good until Friday," he said. "After Friday, I can't protect you from how this goes." Then he was gone into the dark, and a moment later Nadia heard the unmarked car, the one that had watched the inn 3 nights running, pull out behind his. She sat alone with the untouched glass and the green ledger in her bag and felt, for the first time, genuine fear, cold and specific. Not because the threat was empty, because it wasn't. He was right about how it looked. He was right that men she couldn't see had money in Ashworth structures. He was right that the easiest story in the world to tell was that the strange grandchild had inherited an empty estate and pointed fingers to hide her own hand in it. But he was wrong about one thing, and it was the same thing they were all wrong about, the single mistake the whole family made in slightly different clothes. He thought that because she was alone, she was undefended. He didn't know about the fireproof box in the scullery. He didn't know his grandmother had spent 3 years being furniture on purpose, copying real figures out of real banks in a shaking hand, drawing crosses beside every lie. He didn't know that the paper mender's entire life was the discipline of proving what a thing truly was beneath what someone had dressed it up to be, and that a woman who could prove a document was forged from the tremor in its ink could most certainly prove where money went when it left an old lady's account. And he had no idea, sitting in his glass office, that Nadia had already understood the one thing that would decide all of it. She didn't need to convince the family would lie. She needed to reach the other investors, the unseen people whose money sat beside the stolen money in Rupert's fund, the ones who'd been shown Eleanor's drained fortune dressed up as returns. Because the moment those people understood that the impressive performance they'd been sold was partly built on a dead woman's stolen estate, Rupert and Julian Ashworth would stop being predators. They'd become the smallest, most exposed people in a very large room. Nadia took out her phone, and for the first time did something the quiet grandchild had never once done in 11 years of being underestimated. She started to make a list of names. The first name on Nadia's list belonged to a woman named Constance Acaffer, and she was not what Rupert would have expected Nadia to find. Nadia had chosen her carefully, working through the fund's paperwork in the archive boxes, the co-investor schedules Ashworth had left in the estate files, careless because he'd never imagined the estate would be read by someone who understood schedules. She had looked not for the largest investor but for the angriest shape of one. And Constance Acaffer's holding had a shape that told a story. A large early investment, then 18 months ago, a formal written request to withdraw, then nothing. The money hadn't come back. The paper trail simply stopped, replaced by a run of soothing quarterly statements very like the ones Ashworth had sent Eleanor. A person who has already tried to leave and been quietly prevented, Nadia thought, is a person who already suspects. She did not phone. She wrote a letter by hand, because a letter could not be intercepted by an assistant and forwarded to Rupert, and because Nadia trusted paper more than any other thing on earth. She wrote plainly. She said she was Eleanor Thornbury's granddaughter and sole heir. She said she had reason to believe money had left her family's estate improperly and entered a fund in which Ms. Acaffer was also an investor. She said she was not a financial person. She let herself say it, because it was disarming and because it was nearly true, but that she was a conservator, that her whole profession was determining what was genuine and what had been altered, and that she believed she could prove what she was claiming. She gave the address of the Fox and Feathers and nothing else. Then she waited, and while she waited, the watchers made their move. This is a strong seam to expand Nadia's days of waiting, the texture of the village, Mrs. Halloran teaching her the house, small dread building. In the full draft, run it long. It happened on the Wednesday. She came back to the inn from the churchyard to find her room had been searched, not crudely, not smashed, but searched by someone good, someone who'd put nearly everything back and been betrayed only by nearly. Her grandmother's letters had been squared too neatly. A drawer sat a half-inch proud of its runner, and the canvas bag was gone. For one long, sick moment Nadia stood in the doorway and thought they had it, the ledger, the fireproof box's contents, all of it. Then the cold clarity came back, and with it something close to a smile, because she was a conservator, and a conservator never keeps the original where the original can be found. The canvas bag they'd taken held her grandmother's letters precious to her, worthless to them, 11 years of an old woman's affection, and not one page of proof. The ledger and the real statements were in a document tube, wrapped in acid-free tissue, lodged behind the header tank in the inn's cold roof space, where Nadia had put them the first night because putting fragile things somewhere safe and unlikely was simply what her hands did. She had hidden the evidence the way she'd have hidden a 15th-century psalter from a house fire, out of pure professional reflex, and it had saved her without her ever deciding to be clever. But the search told her two things, and both were bad. They knew she had physical proof. And they had decided that Friday's deadline was optional, that they would rather take the proof than pay for her silence. Downstairs, the innkeeper was apologetic and frightened. A man had come, he said, official seeming, said he was from a firm acting for the family, said Miss Merrick had asked him to collect some documents. He'd had a card. He'd been very calm. Did he give a name? Nadia asked. The innkeeper had it written down. The name meant nothing. But the firm on the card was one Nadia knew. She'd seen it on Ashworth's correspondence, a small legal outfit that appeared in the estate papers, only ever attached to the continuation fund and to Halewood, not the family's real solicitors, Ashworth's own. They had shown their hand. And in showing it, they'd handed her another thread, because a lawyer's letterhead is a record, and a record is a thing Nadia could follow. Constance Achafer arrived the next morning. She came herself, without warning, driving up from London before dawn, and she was nothing like the frightened investor Nadia had half imagined. She was a tall, composed woman of about 50 in a good coat, a former forensic accountant, Nadia would learn, who had left the profession to run her late husband's engineering firm, and had put a great deal of that firm's reserve into Rupert's fund on the strength of Julian Ashworth's charm, and a set of returns that had looked, to even her trained eye, entirely real. "I've been trying to get my money out for 18 months, Constance said, sitting at the refectory table where Nadia had laid the archive. "Every request meets a wall of courtesy, new paperwork, a better time next quarter, a gentle suggestion that withdrawing would be unwise given the fund's trajectory." Her mouth was a hard line. "I began to suspect there was no money to withdraw, but suspecting is not proving, and everything they send me is immaculate. I'm an accountant, Miss Merrick. I know when something is too immaculate. I've never been able to get behind it." Nadia went up to the cold roof space and came back down with the document tube. She unwrapped the ledger from its tissue and set it on the table, and beside it Eleanor's parallel figures, and beside those the glossy statements that lied. And then, because Constance Achafer was the first person she'd met in this whole affair who could actually read what was in front of her, Nadia did the thing she had not been able to do with Mrs. Halloran or would ever have done with the family. She showed her working. She walked Constance through it the way she'd walk a colleague through a proven forgery. Here is the surface, here is the truth beneath, here is the exact seam where they part. The continuation fund. The March transfer Ashworth had put his own hand on. The 3 tranches into Halewood dressed as advisory fees. Halewood's correspondence address in Canary Wharf. And Eleanor's crosses, and the flat penciled no. The mark of an old woman who had gone to the bank in person, because she no longer believed the paper. Constance Achafer was silent for a very long time. Then she said quietly, "Halewood, my last statement, the one that told me the fund was up 11%, it cited co-investment income from a Halewood vehicle as the reason." She looked up, and her face had gone the particular color of someone realizing the ground they've stood on for years is painted canvas over a hole. "They showed me your grandmother's stolen money. They showed it to me as proof the fund was thriving. That's how they kept me from withdrawing. They used what they took from a dead woman to convince me my own money was safe." "Yes," Nadia said gently. "How many others?" That, said Nadia, is exactly what I need to find out, and you're the only person alive who both understands the accounting and has a reason to want it torn open." She placed her hand flat on Eleanor's ledger. "I can prove where the money went. You can prove what they did with it and to whom, because you can read the fund from the inside in a way I never could. Alone, either of us is a woman they can make look mad or grasping. Together we're 2 women with proof and standing," Constance finished. Something had come alight in her, the old forensic instinct waking after years asleep. "And if we can find even 3 more investors like me, people who tried to leave and couldn't, then it isn't a grieving relative's grievance anymore. It's a pattern. It's fraud with a shape." and a shape is what regulators and juries and boards cannot look away from. Outside, gravel crunched. Both women went still. Through the tall window, Nadia saw the sleek dark car, and behind it the unmarked one, and Julian Ashworth stepping out with a leather folder under his arm and Rupert beside him. And behind them 2 men in good suits she didn't recognize and instinctively feared more than either cousin or thief. The quiet, expensive kind of men, the ones Rupert had meant when he'd said the people behind Julian. They had come in force on the Thursday, a day before their own deadline, which meant the deadline had never been real. Which meant the search, the stolen bag, this visit. They had already decided that Nadia Merrick was not going to be paid off or frightened off, and had moved to the next thing. "Mrs. Halloran," Nadia said calmly without turning, "please put the ledger and Ms. Acaffer's statements back in the tube and take them out the kitchen way, and don't stop walking until you're somewhere I haven't told you and you'll never tell me." The housekeeper was already moving. Nadia looked at Constance. "They don't know you're here. Your car's round the back. Stay out of sight, hear everything, and whatever happens in this room, do not let them learn there are 2 of us yet." "What are you going to do?" Constance asked. Nadia Merrick smoothed her plain skirt, and picked up her cold cup of tea, and arranged on her face the exact expression she had worn for 11 years. The mild, lost, harmless look of a woman who mended old books and understood nothing about money. "I'm going to be furniture," she said, "one more time, and I'm going to let them tell me everything." She opened the drawing-room door before Ashworth could knock, and smiled at the 4 men who had come to take an estate from a woman they were certain could not stop them. "Gentlemen," she said, "how lovely, I've just put the kettle on."